Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the On Meaningful Work podcast. I'm here with Leyla Acaroglu in our little padded cell between one fern. So just a quick bio. So Dr. Leyla Acaroglu is an internationally known sustainability provocateur, sociologist, and award-winning designer. Focused on systems thinking, sustainability sciences, and creative change making. She was named Champion of the Earth by the United Nations, Changemaker by LinkedIn, and is a main stage TED speaker who leads presentations with leaders around the world on activating positive change for a sustainable, circular, and regenerative future. As a serial social entrepreneur, she founded the Unschool, an experimental knowledge lab for adults, developed the disruptive design method, and is the CEO of creative agency Disrupt Design. Leyla, welcome.
Thank you.
So first question, like when I read out that bio or when you're introduced and you hear that this is the short bio of you.
People often ask if I sleep.
Yeah.
I do.
Yeah.
I love sleeping. It's great. It's very important.
Especially since you're jet lagged as
Yeah,
well.
that's right.
But what comes up? Like what are the emotions you feel? Or
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I'm always a little embarrassed because it does sound like I'm 5 people.
Yeah, you've done,
Yeah.
I think, more than 5 people.
Yeah, but also as well, like I'm always proud. Like I'm very proud of the accomplishments I've managed to achieve. But especially with some of the awards or recognitions, like the Champion of the Earth one, it's definitely kind of a bit hilarious because it is the highest accolade that the UN Environment Program offers, and they give it to 6 people every year, and I didn't even know about it, and when I got the special call about it, I had to Google to make sure that it wasn't like a prank call.
That would make an excellent prank call. Yeah.
You've been, the head of the UN has nominated you as Champion of the Earth. Do you
Yeah.
accept? And I was like, is this an actual thing?
You and Iron Man and Captain America. And
Yeah, that's right. You've won all of these awards. So yeah, no, it's definitely always a bit awkward when somebody chooses to read a full bio and I'm like, oh no, that's not why it's there. It's for reading, not not reading out loud. But yeah.
So, speaking of then Avengers and superheroes, like every superhero has an origin story.
Mm-hmm.
So what's yours? Like, where did you grow up? Where were you born?
Yeah, so I was born in Sydney,
Yeah.
Australia, for the international listeners. And I grew up there until I was like, I think I was 21 and I moved to Melbourne. So Melbourne is my adopted
Oh, wow. Okay.
city of residence in Australia.
Yeah.
And whenever I return home to Australia, it is to Melbourne, very controversially. I lived here for a decade before I went off overseas to start a world-changing organization. That was my goal, and I didn't know what I was doing, so I just went and then ended up landing in New York, where I just decided to stay because people walked faster than me, and that was the first time I'd ever experienced where people move faster than me, because I'm quite a fast mover, not just in how I physically move, but how I like to get things done.
Yep.
And there was a lot of energy and a lot of support for entrepreneurship there.
In New York.
Yes,
Yeah,
a lot
yeah.
more than in Australia.
Yeah,
We have the tall poppy syndrome here. It's a very unfortunate reality, and gender issues also play into that. But in New York, I found this hilarious thing where I tell people I had a startup idea, and they'd be like, great, what can I do to help you? Whereas here they'd be like, oh, you sure you want to do that? Something bad might happen.
Yeah.
And so that energy was extremely important for me in kind of going out further in my entrepreneurial activities. And I actually had to take a whole period of time to try and deprogram my tall poppy syndrome. And now when I come back to Australia, people just think I'm really arrogant because I'm I've learned all of these great tools of how to advocate for yourself and how to collaborate and how to ensure that, ideas become action, which unfortunately still hasn't really kind of become a solid part of the Australian innovation ecosystem, which I would love to see change. But, there's those Victorian roots or something coming through.
Yeah. So before that, though, so you did your schooling in Sydney?
I did, yeah. I did
Yeah.
my schooling in Sydney, and then I went to Enmore Design Centre to study product design, which I quit after 2 years. And then I moved to Melbourne to study at RMIT. That's why I came down here, to study social science environment. And then I ended up spending 10 years at RMIT, working as a researcher at the Centre for Design, and then doing my PhD and teaching in the industrial design program, yeah.
And what were you like in school? Like as
An
a kid?
asshole.
AKA future entrepreneur.
Very loud, very boisterous, always the class clown. I had enough energy for 5 people.
Yeah.
This is why my bio sounds like 5 people. But also I was always bored. So I loved the creative subjects like drama and art, and anything where I was like physically engaged was great for me because that's how I learn, like in a very experiential way. But things that required tests or writing, like writing, I have mild dyslexia, so it was always really difficult, and then I would just be like really cheeky. And so my report cards would always be like, Leyla has a lot of potential if only she would focus. Basically, AKA is she shut up. So yeah, and I did struggle a bit actually in certain parts of my schooling because I think with traditional education, it's it's cookie cutter, right? And there was a period where I had some like bad teachers who I didn't get on with early on, and that really kind of traumatized me in the sense that I really took it on myself that there was something wrong with me, and it took a while to kind of get over that. But I think the key thing with education for me was when I found things that I loved, I did extremely well. Like I got top 10% in the state for design. But things that I was like, that were very traditionally taught, I really struggled with, right? Like I loved math, but then when I got into high school, it was so boring, that I literally remember in year 10 going, I'm never going to use this. I'm not going to learn any more math. And I just stopped my brain from learning it, which was a bit annoying when I went to design school and was sitting in an engineering class going like, oh shit.
Yeah.
I really should have listened
Your
to
10 maths, come back to me.
It's like Pythagoras theorem is actually really useful. I wish I'd listened.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I didn't do extremely well in high school because by the time I got to the end of high school, I was like, whatever, just give me the piece of paper, let me out of this prison. And then I got into design school and I really, really loved it. But I quit because I was learning how to essentially reinvent a lot of the world's problems rather than solve them. And so I ended up studying sociology. And this is like a classic story because I didn't do very well like on my university entrance thing. And I was quite bored in school. When I got into social science, which is all like reading, discussion, debate, reflection, writing, I just flourished. And I got the University Award for Academic Excellence.
Wow.
I know.
That's crazy.
I went
Yeah.
from like a struggling student to like full HDs.
Yeah. So you mentioned a couple of things. So firstly, actually before we get to design school, was there an incident that happened that you look back on in your childhood that you think that makes sense as to, it makes sense, I'm doing what I'm doing now because of what happened?
I mean, we are all very complex beings filled with multiple experiences and layers. But I think that for me, like caring about the planet, as my work tends to be in now, started with me caring a lot about people. So, my mum's favorite story is to tell me during the 40-hour famine when I was a kid and never quite getting through it, but still managing to like collect all the money in the street. But there was definitely a very strong humanitarian interest from a young age, like, and also animals, and like I'm very kind of empathetic to living things. But I would say there was like a couple key experiences that happened early on as a young adult. So when I was in design school, when I was like 19 or something, I also was volunteering with the Refugee Committee for Amnesty International because for those of you who are international and don't know about Australia's horrendous, horrific history and current behaviour towards refugees who come to Australia, we have a tendency to do extremely inhumane things to them and put them in detention centres in the middle of the desert or send them to remote islands that we funded, essentially detention centres to be built on. So I was extremely distressed by this system of what was going on. And so at the time I started pen paling with a young woman who was in the detention centre in the middle of the desert in Australia, which I can't remember the name of right now. And she was a young Iranian woman, and she was similar age to me, and I think we exchanged maybe 4 or 5 letters. And in that process, like, we were just chit-chatting like you would do, like, what are your interests, And what I had this really profound experience, which was that she and I were very similar. Like, I think she wanted to study education, but she was very interested in like elevating herself, like any young person tends to be. And it really struck me as really profound that there are certain people in the world who get to live in a more free, open, and then get more opportunities than other people. And that it made me feel very responsible for the freedom that being raised in Australia and had given me. My father's Turkish, and, my mum decided that she wanted her girls to be raised in Australia. So that's how we ended up moving here from Turkey. So, I feel like that really kind of sat with me, and the kind of way it manifested itself was I have a voice, and if I was in that position, I would want people like me being outside of that position to help use their voice to advocate for these kinds of problems and challenges. In the end, she never responded to a letter, and I think she was returned, which was a very common thing that happened. So it really just struck me as far as like agency and opportunity. And like I always say now, for every one of me, there's like tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of women who are equally capable, but the systems of the countries that they live in do not enable them to be educated or speak for themselves or make choices that don't involve them ending up having to be, less mobile in their life choices. So, that's something that I carry with me a lot still to this day.
Yeah, wow. I mean, it's funny that we're sitting at this point in history where, speaking of Iran, and speaking of people's agency, that's really coming to the fore now, especially with women in Iran. And,
I mean, it's profound, I think, because for those of us who've been socialized in Western countries, we think we take freedom for granted. We take the freedoms that we are given by the culture and system around us as if they're given and they're going to be here forever. But that's not the case, because Iran was also an extremely liberal place in the 1970s. My mum went hitchhiking through the Middle East in a miniskirt in the 70s, That's how she met my father. My mum's British. So, it's definitely like it's like I always say, anyone can be a refugee at any point, with climate change as well. We'll have people from, so-called advanced, economies ending up as refugees because of the fact that they will lose the physical land that they live on, or they're forced to move, migrate, etc. So I just think it's like, certainly the perception that Australia had and still continues to have against these, like, what we would call boat people, which is just so whatever, derogatory. And this idea that it's like an us and them thing, I just found it so tragic, because, that's also the kind of mentality that enables people, minorities, or, whether it be people with different abilities or gender, whatever, to be controlled or contained by the way the system wants them to be, right? Like, so we just want everybody to be in this space because it's easier and safer for those of us who have power to continue to maintain it. So in societies where minorities or people who have traditionally not had access to power are able to elevate themselves, you get this really incredible transformation. And I think, my heart and soul goes to all of the women and men who are currently risking their lives in Iran to help to crack open that extremely restrictive and tragic situation.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, there is... So doing a little bit of research before this chat, I came across... I mean, you've spoken at TED and TEDx quite a few times. But in one of your TEDx talks, I think you mentioned that you were on a road trip, and then I think it was your friend's mum who mentioned... You want to tell the story?
Oh, when I was like 5?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's funny. Yeah. This is a funny story. Yeah, so... Yeah, well, in Australia, growing up in the 80s, you had the hole in the ozone layer was a huge issue, like a big environmental issue. And specifically because the UV here was so high that you would get like the increase of skin cancer, etc. So I was like 5 or something, and I don't think we were on a road trip. I think I was just getting dropped off at school or something. Okay. But I so remember this like really old 1970s car, and I was clearly not wearing a seatbelt, sitting in the back, and the mum was telling me all about this hole in the ozone layer and that it was going to kill us all. And so I was like petrified. Like I remember it so vividly. Like my little 5-year-old brain was like, I don't want to die from the hole in the sky kind of thing. And so I start like coming up with solutions, which is basically how I operate. And I had 3. One was to hide under blankets. She said that was she said that was probably not going to work long term. My other idea was just put like sunshades up, like you know in school how they have sunshades. It's like we could just build sunshades everywhere. That will protect us. Apparently, she said that was unfeasible as well. And then my third was to just live inside forever.
Pop vitamin D pills.
Yeah, well, I mean, I didn't know what that was at 5, right? So, you know, they weren't sophisticated solutions, but nonetheless, she shut them all down. But it stuck with me, this idea that, like, you know, there was this big scary thing going on that was going to threaten my future, which I think is how a lot of young people feel right now with climate change and the climate anxiety. But a beautiful story on this is that, yes, it had a big impact on me. And then at the 30th anniversary of the Montreal Protocol, which is the landmark environmental legislation signed by 196 members of the UN to phase out CFCs that were in hairsprays and deodorants and refrigerators that were causing the hole in the ozone layer, I was invited to host a roundtable with 9 of the world's leaders on why it was such a successful intervention.
That's
so it was
incredible.
Like, it's like this full circle.
Wow.
So I went to the 30th anniversary of the Montreal Protocol in the UN and got to interview 9 world leaders about like why was this successful, and it was really fascinating because my work now is really about like how do we make transformative change and that sticks and that is intrinsic versus extrinsic. And there was some really interesting things that came out of that discussion about like collaboration between countries and innovation as being the key thing, because these companies had to very quickly change from the CFCs to something else, right? So
because I mean, just staying on that for a second before we get back to you, that seems like a fascinating distinction between the ozone layer and climate change, because the Montreal thing happened and then it seemed that things happened really quickly after that.
Yeah.
Things were put into place.
Yeah.
And now
and the hole in the ozone layer is recovering.
Yeah.
Right? However, there's always a kind of caveat.
Yeah.
Hydrofluorocarbons, they're a big contributor to climate change, which I think they were part of the solution set. If I remember correctly, I'm not a scientist, so a chemical scientist, I mean. But I think that HFCs are a problem for climate change, like quite a big one. So actually that was discussed at the Montreal Protocol, that they need to adapt the protocol, which is still in place, to include the climate change causing gases that were put in place afterwards. So, yeah.
But I think what's extraordinary is that the ozone layer thing happened so quickly, but then climate change comes along, and then there's Kyoto, there's Paris, there's Copenhagen.
Yeah, but there's the climate change is, well, there's a number of things here. First of all, you had very clear correlative relationship between the physical products and the impact. Okay, so it was very easy for them to say hairsprays, refrigerators, aerosols, they're the kind of boogeyman that we need to create change in. Yeah. And it was not a huge number of products. Okay. Whereas climate change is embedded in absolutely everything. Our entire economy is lubricated by fossil fuels. And whether it be like that cup of coffee or, the server power that you guys are listening to this through, that has a carbon footprint or an impact on the planet. And so, and then the thing is it's not just carbon emissions that are problems. It's also methane. It's also the hydrofluorocarbons, nitrogen. Like there's all of these, nitrous oxide. There's all of these different factors. And so the agriculture sector is a huge contributor to climate change with the nitrous oxide from, so it's like, it's such a kind of integrated part of our economy that you can't just pick one part and go, let's all like figure out how to solve these 5 products or 20 or whatever it was with the Montreal Protocol. So that kind of complexity is, I think, why there's been so much resistance, but also the difference between the fossil fuel industry and the power that they wield as far as the economy and governments goes versus like the heating and cooling sector, which is basically the main contributors, is kind of a different weight. And the oil and gas industry has known about climate change for over 100 years. They've known, I mean, it's basic science. But, you know, it's an interesting story, actually, because so what got me, like, as an adult interested in sustainability? So yes, I had that experience as a kid, but obviously I didn't put two to two together for a while. I was only 5.
You were 5.
Yeah. But you know, and also I had no real, like, my mom's a bit of a hippie, but I didn't get any, like, true environmental education, like in high school, or I don't remember being taught anything about nature. I don't remember being, like, given any, like, experiential wonderment about the possibility of the universe. Just I got taught some pretty standard stuff. So then when I was in design school, and I was like, I think it must have been the second year, and one of our professors, like, opens, you know, this textbook, and I remember it being one of those terribly small printed textbooks with like double columns and small pictures and, like, really dense. And he had just said, like, we're going to learn about this thing called the Gaia theory, which is that everything in nature is interconnected, which was proposed by James Lovelock, who is a scientist who is like a renegade scientist. You know, he basically used to work for NASA, and he figured out how to measure the life on planets based on the atmosphere that was kind of being radiated from the planets. You could tell out what kind of life was going on. And then he actually was really critical in discovering some of the science behind the hole in the ozone layer, right? So he was really critical in that. In the 1970s, he actually identified CFCs and started to do that correlative relationship. But for years now, he's been, like, you know, basically a scientist out of his shed in the UK, right? He actually died recently. But he was an incredible, this idea of the Gaia hypothesis or theory is that the Earth is a living organism, the entire planet, and its atmosphere is like how it breathes, and it sounds kind of woo-woo, but this is like a hardcore scientist who was able to prove it and prove that basically everything on the planet is interconnected, and so actions have reactions. And I'm sitting in this class, and this guy's just, like, rambling on about this stuff, and it was truly like my brain exploded.
So just to place us, this is when you were at uni.
Yeah, well, I was at design school in Enmore, and it was my engineering class, and that professor was very old. I cannot remember his name, but and we were sitting in, like, a demountable, like, you know, one of those, like, really a little bit like this, a like very sterile environment.
This might bring back some memories.
Yeah. And it was hilarious because he's saying this, and he's going, you know, so I think he gave some example of interrelationships between, like, environmental impacts and human choices. But he also did it very briefly. Like, it wasn't like a detailed class. So I remember my whole, like, perception of the world changed in, like, a minute.
That's extraordinary.
It was extraordinary. And also because I remembered hearing about, like, the butterfly effect. And it was like these two things kind of came together, and I was like, well, this makes a lot of sense. But it was like, and I remember turning to the rest of the class and, like, completely freaking out, which was not abnormal for me. But, you know, I was one of 2 girls in my design program, and I turned to the rest of the class, which were all boys, and I was like, oh my God, guys, what are we going to do? Like, and this kid sitting next to me, he was like, Leyla, I don't know why you're freaking out. It's not like, and I know this word for word, right? Because it's so etched in my brain. It's not like any of these catastrophic environmental impacts will affect us in our lifetime, so why should we care?
Wow.
Right.
And that boy grew up to be the Prime Minister now.
Well, you know, he probably grew up to work for a car company because a lot of young people studying industrial product design are either into cars or furniture. It seems to be I was motivated by how inefficient remote controls were. I was so frustrated by all the buttons. And it also seemed to me that, like, design was a really fun and interesting career where you get to solve problems that seemed like way more interesting to me than other things. But anyway, so I had this experience, and it really was like the before experience and after experience, my life was completely different. And it was because it made so much sense. Like this idea that everything's interconnected and that nature is this, like, we are part of nature and that the whole planet's an ecosystem. Like, it was so, it fitted so like nicely, but it also annoyed me that I had no idea about this. So I go off to the library, as one did in those days, and I got books. There was like a section this big in the library on like eco design, which is what it was called then. And I got hired whatever books I could get, and then proceeded to read them. And like, I remember in another class with that poor guy who was teaching us about how to make glass. I remember it, you know, you have to like molten glass. It's like really energy intensive. I was reading, I think it was a Hawkins book on like the interconnected relationship of nature, and like it was about the salmon and the bears and the trees and the forest, and I like started crying. I was like, oh my God, it's so beautiful.
Wow.
I was really profound. Like those couple of weeks really kind of, you know, and I read Victor Papanek, which is a guy who really kind of was the first modern designer to like hold design world accountable for the influence and impact that they have on the world. He calls cars death machines, etc. So all of this stuff came together, and I was like, okay, I am not going to design crap anymore. I'm only going to design like eco products. So that was my like stance. And so then every brief I got in every class, I was like, I'm going to make this an eco product. And the teacher would be like, whatever, Leyla. I mean, by this point, they were probably like, whatever, Leyla, because the pain in the butt student was also present in university level as well as the high school level. And it was funny because I remember like we got like our CAD class where you're learning how to do computer-aided design. We had to make an internet-connected device. This was in the like early 2000s, and I was like, who wants a refrigerator that talks to the internet? That makes no sense to me. So I was, Internet of Things was just burgeoning. So, and then I was told that I would fail if I didn't follow the brief specifically, because that's what you get taught in design school. So anyway, whatever. I started making a whole bunch of very like bad designs, like intentionally. Like we had a brief. It was very common in design school to get a brief where you get a piece of cardboard and you have to make a chair. This is very standard design school. Actually, this was before I had my epiphany. I think I was just a complete pain in the ass from the beginning because our professor wanted to make it like interesting. So he said you had to design it for either a Bondi Beach party, think about it, cardboard at the beach with sand, or for a desperate and dateless ball, which was a thing in the early 2000s in Sydney. Truly called before Tinder. Well, these were these big parties that were thrown for people, and it was like a kind of
desperate and dateless.
Yes, truly called that.
So you self-identify as desperate and dateless,
and you go to a big party. I mean, it was before Tinder. I mean, what else are you supposed to do? So anyway, I was like, okay, fine. I was such an asshole. I designed a giant groping booth. Truly. Yeah, truly. I mean, I do not encourage sexual harassment in any way, shape or form. But I was like, what else happens at one of these? It was like a kissing booth, but it was like an anonymous one. So you could go behind the screen and sit if you so chose, and somebody could choose to get a feel.
Yeah, wow.
And I got a high distinction for that. Not because of my design, which was really ugly, but because I fulfilled the brief. Okay, so the brief said it had to hold 100 kilos of someone sitting, and it had to be fit either one of these scenarios. And it fit perfectly for the context. So reluctantly, I received high marks. But like the teacher was like, and that continued. I made a toilet paper recycling machine. Yep. That was a machine
like for used toilet paper?
No, which, it's kind of a bit gross. No, for turning cereal boxes in your house into toilet paper. Yeah. I mean, I just made a whole bunch of random shit, to be completely honest, but yeah.
But I suppose that's, in a way, that's a microcosm of how the world works, and that, like, for most engineers or designers or whatever, like, you do your job, you get a brief.
Oh, yeah. You have to follow the brief. Like, that's also one of the terrible things about the transition to sustainability or the circular economy is that a lot of people are restricted by the requests on them. And so I'm always advocating for designers to do subversive design, which is like figuring out how to work within the kind of, nuances of what they're being requested to get a more sustainable solution to their clients. But also redesigning the brief where possible is critical too, because a lot of the time, especially if you're in a consultancy situation, someone will come to you and say, we just want a better, faster, sexier, cooler version of X. Right? And so the form is already like locked in. But like if you take any consumer household product, a kettle, a hairdryer, or a remote control or a refrigerator, their form is just repetitive. Like people, this is the whole thing about iteration versus disruption, right? So what happens is they come in and they say, oh, well, so the iPhone was a truly disruptive product in the sense that this had not been done before. And we were all still stuck using our thumbs to text. rather than our fingers.
Yeah.
And, Nokia had come up with a similar product. They had tested it. The consumer base were quite freaked out by it. And so they chose not to go to market, which was the death of Nokia, basically.
Yep.
So I always tell clients, don't be Nokia when it comes to sustainability, because we are now in this extremely critical time where not just because of the SDGs or the climate challenge or the waste crisis or the biodiversity crisis, but like I call it the values economy. Like people do not want to work for companies who do not represent their values. And it's very rare to find an actual human who believes that we should destroy nature because they have built in them the understanding that we all need nature to survive. How present people are in that as a reality versus just a kind of intuition is, that's the problem, is like you can have that as a reality but not actually have the tools or the language or the ability to kind of action anything on that. But so this kind of lack of willingness from a lot of big players to completely reimagine the functionality of products and services so that we can deliver them and the value that they offer. So the functionality is delivered, but it's delivered in a completely new way. And that's really what the kind of proposition of the circular economy is like not to stop delivering value. So it's not go back to the dark ages. It's deliver value to eliminate waste, to cycle materials through the economy in a sustainable and regenerative way, and to figure out how to create beautiful experiences that get the needs of humans met and customers met and economically viable for the company, but in a completely new way. And that's really the reason we have some really amazing upstarts who are completely breaking the barriers and boundaries, and a lot of existing companies who are like, whoa, this is, we don't know about this yet. Yeah. So it's like a very interesting time.
So there is one thing we have in common, and that's the use of the term disruptive. And I'm guessing you've heard of Clayton Christensen.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
And that's, I suppose, that theory, disruption innovation theory, is inspiration for me because it's really about not just following the status quo and making status quo 2.0, 3.0, 4.0. It's really figuring out where is there no value and how can we provide value there, and then from that, move up the chain.
Well, so from what I understand with Clay's proposition, and he's written extensively about like how Uber is not a disruptive innovation, right? Yeah. So these ideas of who calls themselves disruptors, he's like, technically, according to my theory, which is kind of great. But from what I understand is that, it's about identifying markets that are not currently, for lack of a better term, exploited.
Or served.
Thank you, and then finding solutions, entirely new ways of delivering that. So the way I use disruption in regards to the disruptive design method is really about using design as a tool to challenge the status quo of a system, right? So taking that systems lens, which is that everything is interconnected, therefore interdependent, and therefore dynamic and dynamically affected by other elements of the system, right? So if you take that perspective and you look at whether it be a cultural condition or a product or a policy, you can identify where in the system you can apply an intervention to then disrupt the way that system is playing out. So it's very much about intent to intervene. And that intent doesn't come from you being like, some people think disruption is to make noise or to make a mess or to be aggressive or no, not at all. It's very actually much about understanding the dynamics to then be able to say, this system is operating in this way. So you have this feedback and this dynamic, and we want to transform this system so that it's more regenerative or more sustainable or more equitable. And so then in order to do that, now we understand the system, we can come in and apply an intervention here or here, and it's going to disrupt the system.
Exactly.
Right?
And just going back to Uber, so Uber, he said it's not disruptive to the taxi industry because Uber, in fact, is just a better taxi
poaching,
service. Whereas Uber ride sharing could be seen as disruptive to car ownership, because that's where people who wouldn't necessarily buy a car get to it, get from A to B.
Or like before you had the car sharing from Uber, it was FlexCar.
FlexCar
was the first one. So, and these I think are more of the disruptive startups because of the fact that, as you say, from Clay Christensen's perspective, the founders are identifying an underserved market, people who can't afford cars or don't want to own cars or live in the city where parking is a nightmare, but they still need the functionality of getting from A to B or going away for the weekend or picking up, kids from school, whatever. And so then they're creating an entirely new service model that enables that activity to happen.
Yeah. And also, the way I see it is, so with the Disruptive Business Network, like a big part of it is meaningful work. And where I think the theory applies to you personally is, if you follow the normal chain of events, go to school, go to uni, get a good job, promotion, that's like, iPhone 2.0, 3.0, 4.0. Whereas to disrupt yourself, you have to really, I think, take stock of your values and who you are and your talents, and then maybe, forget about your ego and then do something that's meaningful. And that's...
Yeah, I would say I'm driven by passion and frustration.
Yeah.
Right? Like a kind of slightly unhealthy mix of the two. Because nearly everything I've done, and that has usually led to my personal success or a project success or financial ruin, all of the above, has come because I've encountered a system failure that has just infuriated me. Right? Even going to design school, I remember I remember being like, 17, whenever you're supposed to make that important life decision about what the you're going to do with the rest of your life. And my friend, who was a graphic designer, had said, you should try design because you're really creative, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, yeah, but that sounds boring. I don't want to just like make ads. And he goes, well, what about products? I'm like, well, yeah, remote controls really annoy me. And he's like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, I don't know why there are so many buttons on there. Like, why? And I've always wondered why. And I still don't understand why. Why? Right? I mean, I know why now, but it's dumb. It doesn't make any sense. It's just like over functionality. No one knows how to use them all. In fact, anytime I pick up a remote, I'm like, which of the arrows gives me the up and down and the volume? Like, there's three things I need. So these kinds of things, that infuriating, like, why is it so, annoying or frustrating, has driven me a lot. And so then even when I quit design school and went to study sociology, that was like, well, why are humans such a mess? Like, why does this kid not care? And why do I care? And now that seems like a profoundly different outcome from the same experience, right? So my life has changed and this kid's like, whatever, goes about his life, does not care. And that was shocking and surprising and frustrating. And so that drove me to inquire more about that. And how I ended up in systems thinking was also like trying to understand, like, how does change happen, and why is it that some changes for the better or worse kind of end up occurring and others don't last. And so that kind of led me into that whole inquiry around like systems dynamics and understanding. So, and then a lot of the projects I've done are, again, like, I see something and it infuriates me so much that I then am like so driven to like make a thing that does it better or fixes it or, and so it's kind of like
I think you cannot discount fury and frustration and those feelings to point you in the right direction, because I think acting on those is really important. Like,
I think creativity has to be driven by something. And some people, it's like that quest to just like explore and understand, and maybe it's a more intrinsic motivator. Whereas I feel like I'm a little bit extrinsically motivated from a lot of the projects I do, because I want to see change. Like, I want to see that change happen in the world around me. And the point that I realized that I could intervene in the system is that I do know how to create things that are usually fun and engaging and colorful and exciting and a bit evocative, and they have a transformative effect. And I figured that out quite young, just through a number of little random projects that I did. And that was able to then build over time to be able to do that at a bigger scale and to kind of drive disruption in my version of disruption, which is about, again, that systems intervention to create a better outcome with the intent to see transformation. So it's been a very interesting journey, because I realized, like, I could help other people make change by creating tools that enable them to make change. So it's I kind of take my own experience where, by the time I had finished university, I was working as a research assistant in one of the universities at RMIT, and I was doing projects around sustainable design. Like, I kind of achieved a career position.
So just to backtrack a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So you had that experience in design school with the teacher.
Right, and then I quit design school.
You quit design school.
Mm-hmm. Quite spectacularly. After, of course, a few more disruptive elements.
Throw down a smoke bomb and then.
No, I made a piece of industrial art that was very controversial for our end of year exhibition. That they told me.
Not the groping booth. Something else.
No,
okay.
it was. They told us we had to have a business card holder to like show our work to potential clients, and we had to put up renders. And I didn't want to because everything I'd created was pretty boring in my view at the time. And so I went to this place called Reverse Garbage in Sydney, and it's where you can just get things that have just been like from film sets or whatever.
Oh, cool.
And I made a business card holder that was ginormous, and it was like, imagine like some wire like sticking out from the wall, and then I threaded old 8mm film, and then like the film was dangling, and then I put a little paper clip, and then I like stuck my green business card, so it was like a tree, and you could pluck the business card.
Cool.
It was huge.
Yeah.
And it stuck out from the wall.
Yeah.
Now, I didn't realize, because I made it at like 4 a.m, as most design students do, that the film had some kind of mild 1940s porn on it.
Ooh.
So when I got there with my garbage bag that it was in,
Yeah.
and I pulled it out, the teacher, the same one who had to give me the marks on the groping booth, was just like, no. And I was like, yes. It was so ugly, right?
Yeah.
It was amazing, but
Yeah.
ugly. And then, of course, one of the boys was like, oh my God, it's got porn on it. Which it
Yeah.
wasn't. It was like a lady in a leopard print, like bikini rolling around on a couch. And she might have taken her bikini off. But also, we're talking 8mm film.
Yeah,
So
so
it was
tiny. Yeah.
teeny,
Yeah.
right? So in the end, I made a protest and they let me display it. People loved it. All of my business cards got taken, by the way.
Yeah.
Right? Because who doesn't want to interact and like pluck business cards?
That's
And then that was the point where I didn't come back because
Okay.
I was encouraged not to. And I
Yep.
also decided this was not the place for me. But yeah, so I did leave with a little bit of a, controversial.
Okay. That's a great story, though. and then why sociology? Was it just?
Well, it's interesting. So I wanted to study eco design. That was what I'd learned about, you know, and that was it. And I knew I had to find somewhere to study that. And at the time, the only place in the world I could find it was in the UK, in London. There was a school that was teaching it, and I just did not have the resources to go to the UK to study. And so I had found, like, on my deep research, that there was this website for an organization at RMIT called the Center for Design, and there was a button that said, do you want to study eco-design? And I was like, yes. And I clicked the button, and the button would go nowhere, dead link. And after like a couple of weeks, I like every few days went just hoping the button would be
work.
repaired. And I sent an email, nobody responded. So then in one of my days of desperation, I was like, well, maybe there's this course on, like, I'll go deep into the RMIT website. And of course, I found like the normal industrial design program, and I spoke to them, but they didn't have like a sustainability bend. And then I found this course called Social Science Environment, and I read the like description, and I was like, this is perfect. This is exactly what I want to understand. I want to understand how nature works, and I want to understand why people are messed up, and politics and philosophy. And it was hilarious because the day I saw it, the applications had closed like 2 days before. So I emailed them, and they were like, if you can get your application in the next 2 days, we'll consider it. And so within like 2 weeks, I'd packed my life up and moved to Melbourne to do this course. So yeah, and it was amazing. It was really amazing. So RMIT's Social Science Environment program was just such a rich learning experience for me. And
How did that differ from design school in terms of the learning experience?
yeah, it's interesting because design school is really fun because it's very proactive and hands-on, and there's a lot of like experimenting and making, and whereas social science school is a lot of thinking and talking and reflecting and discussing, and and so it was a very different experience. Like rather than your hands, it was very much your head. But it was like so enriching for me because these were all things I cared about. Social science is very much about the human condition and experience. It's a lot about humanities. It's really about, this program especially was very much about like, how do we address human issues, social issues, and how do we also, keep a functioning society and deal with all the morals and ethics. And so, I learned so much. I was petrified of the economics class because remember I'd quit maths, right? And I was sure it was going to involve maths, but it wasn't at all. And it was really, it was very much about understanding the mechanisms that motivate behavior within the economy. And I even have a class in my disruptive design method called gamification and game theory, right? Which is pretty much, gamification is the practice of designing things that kind of evoke a gamified response, so they're interactive. And game theory is what economists do to understand network behavior and humans. And it's like, when you put them together, you're like, oh, the whole world is gamified, and every human gamifies their own experience of the world to maximize the utility of life, right? So anyway, I learned a lot about philosophy and psychology and sociology, and all the environmental subjects were super depressing. We had one environmental scientist lady, she was quite old as well, Irish lady. Every single class she would end, and then we're going to die. She had 12 classes that all the different ways humans are going to die en masse. My favorite was the worms that go under your skin that you can, no, that was not favorite. It was traumatizing.
Yikes.
Yeah.
But then you stick around there.
I then got a job. So actually, back to the button. So I don't study at that university, that program, but I go to RMIT and I'm there. And after a couple months, I find the office somewhere in the buildings of this Center for Design, and I knock on the door and I'm like, hey guys, you have a button that doesn't work. It's really frustrating. I would like to volunteer to help you fix buttons that don't work on your website. And at the time, this guy, Tim Grant, who was a life cycle assessment practitioner, kind of was like, oh, well, what do you want to do? And I'm like, I don't know, this life cycle stuff sounds fun. And he was like, okay, sure, I'll take you on. And I actually just ran a training with him yesterday for 2 days. He's taught me nearly everything I know about the science behind assessing the impacts of products and services, and life cycle thinking was like also another transformative way of understanding. It exposes the hidden life of things, and I got to learn how to do it and then decide I really didn't like doing it. And then there I helped build the first online life cycle assessment tool for designers that didn't exist. And then after a while, I got very, very frustrated by the inefficiency of a university system. So I quit and started my first company at 25.
Wow. And that was Eco
Innovators. Yeah.
And was that a consultancy or was it
Well, I didn't really know what it was, to be honest. And to this day, I've now started 3 companies and 1 not-for-profit, and every single one of them, I don't really know what they're going to do when I start them. It's kind of a feel your way through, pick your own adventure style business decision making. But no, I really wanted to create tools and resources that helped elevate sustainability into design. And so I started this company, and actually Tim and I got an office together because he quit his job as well around the same time, and we got this office in the city. And at the same time, the city of Melbourne had put out a competition for finding a new use for those pillars, the silver pillars like on Swanston Street. So if you are international, think a tiny 1 meter silver pillar that closes but it opens, and people used to sell newspapers and magazines. But then because of all of the 7-Elevens and the different retail environments in the city, they became, redundant, and they were a piece of infrastructure that stayed on the city but were getting heavily graffitied, and just they became like a blight for the city of Melbourne. So they ran this design competition, and I proposed to convert it into a microcosm of sustainably produced, locally produced and sustainably produced products that would like poach people at Christmas time to buy locally made and more environmentally preferable things. And so I won it, which got me this thing for free for I can't remember, 2 years or something. And so I converted this one. It's Swanston and Little Collins. It's now a crepe stand.
Yeah, there's a crepe stand.
So let me tell you what happened. So in the end, I was the only one who actually did anything with the pillar.
Yep.
So it was the only pillar. And this, I think, was in 2010, 8, 7? I can't remember what year it was. But, and the city of Melbourne loved it. And so then they basically used it as an example, and we helped basically get a new trading policy implemented that was these micro entrepreneurial activities. So because of my pillar, all of those other pillars got recommissioned as micro trading. And so now you have people selling art, crepes, cactuses, you name it. So this was my first experience where I was like, oh shit, you can really make a difference by proving through a creative intervention that there's another way of doing things, right? And the cool thing about that is they are all like micro activities. You know, it's not like some big brand who's selling their products just a bit further on the street. It's like local kind of artisans or craft people, and this French guy who did the crepe stand. And it's still there. It's been there for like a decade
really
now.
Busy.
Yes, I know. Yeah. So, and there was like, I've got it somewhere in my archives, like they basically made like a flyer to promote to the city of Melbourne, and they had like a picture of me and my pillar on the front of it. So yeah, it was a really cool experience. And this, at the same time, I got a grant to create an educational tool called The Secret Life of Things, which was an animation around, so YouTube was like just becoming popular at the time, old days. And I wanted to make like a short video that explained sustainability to design students, because the big issue I saw was that educators were not educated, and the learning gap for them was really high, right? So if you're teaching design, for you to then learn about this life cycle stuff and sustainability was quite big. So I wanted to fill that gap with very easy to access tools that also taught the educator, that didn't just teach the students. So animations are great because it fills time, and this one was really funny. So it was called Life Psychology, and it was a cell phone whose name was Mr. Erickson, and he had he was having an existential crisis because it was a flip phone, and he had been abandoned for a newer model that got a camera, and truly this was at the time when cameras just got put into phones. And so he goes to see a past life regression therapist who's called Dr. Fraud. And he goes through his whole life. So we learn about his life cycle stages and where he was made and all these minerals. And then he prescribes him a kind of redesign, right? So in these 5 minutes, you learn all about the life of the product. You learn about how to think about how to redesign it from the start. And it's kind of funny and cute. And I had to do all the voices because I didn't have enough budget for that. So it's quite hilarious. And we won a Melbourne Design Award for it. It got put on display in the Leonardo da Vinci Museum in Milan on permanent exhibition.
Whoa.
And just last week, I got asked for it again for another exhibition. It's in another exhibition. And also the Melbourne Now, I ended up during Melbourne Now, which was a big exhibition of design and art. My animation played there for that whole, it was like a kind of showcase of like creative interventions. Yeah.
So your first two things have a life of their own.
And actually it was interesting because we then ended up collaborating with the Design and Technologies Teachers Association, and because I made all of these educational tools around it, so bad right now when I look at them, I'd be like, wow, Leyla. Just in the aesthetics, right? And then that actually we got funding from the Department of Education to make ones for high schools, because the first one was for university. And then that we were able to work around with them, the Design and Technologies Teachers Association, to get life cycle thinking into the curriculum. So for the D&T national curriculum in Victoria, it has life cycle thinking in it now.
Wow.
So there's all of these things, sure. At the time, you don't realize that that's what's happening. But when I did my PhD, my PhD was on like how to create a disruptive design practice or a pro-sustainability practice is what, and I had to reflect on all of these activities and like understand like what was going on here. And it really was about using this kind of creativity to drive change. And so each of these cases and more, like I've got many more examples of projects. I made a design play cards that ended up being used by the UN, and making things that make sense to people, making them accessible in different formats, all of these kinds of ingredients that really help you build the ability to make transformative change in the world around you and to leverage your agency, even if it's small. So like when I started, nobody would give me any money to do anything. Like that $10,000 grant was like so much money, right? And
I mean, thinking about it now, like 10,000 doesn't seem
oh my God, no.
that much at all.
No, not at all, no. And I think that's the same thing, like with the shop and all these other things. Like there was like all these little bits of money coming in, which is why I laugh. Like I had no business plan, just didn't know what I was doing. But I think that all of these like experiments really helped me then lead up to like the bigger, bolder, more disruptive things like the Unschool. because I had all these micro wins, because that shop was like, I literally just had an idea and I built it myself. Like truly, I used to have to put up sheets. Like it was so low rent. Like it was so
Back
like,
to the blankets. Yeah?
like to do the build out, and we'd go on like a Sunday and like put up a sheet and then like be in there like putting little things into. It was just so like, it was so ad hoc, right?
But also, just this entrepreneurial drive that you have, like, what do you attribute that to? Like
Frustration and passion.
Okay. So your parents weren't entrepreneurs.
No, my dad's. I mean, my dad was is a chemical engineer. He worked on dust control systems or pollution control systems from factories. So he definitely had like an environmental influence. But when I was growing up, he had gotten quite obsessed with computers. So when they first came out, so, you know, he was like, magic boxes. Yeah. And so he actually built a customer relations management platform called Efficiency, like in the 80s.
Whoa.
And like has had that for years. And now, possibly because of his daughter's influence, he's like adding all the ESG criteria into it and trying to build like this like mastermind of like how to manage assets and you know, like, anyway, he's very desperate for me to be involved in somehow. But I think the thing is like, you know, he said this to me the other day. He actually said, the difference for me is I always saw what I did as a small business, but you see yourself as an entrepreneur, which is interesting because I think that's a cultural shift in time, right? Where entrepreneurs are a bit riskier. I think most people don't make business plans until they're forced to.
Until you're pitching for money or something.
Right, and this is interesting about that. So I did actually go through a period of trying to raise money when I was in New York, when I had founded the Unschool, and I actually made a very conscious choice not to do that after my experience. And that was because I didn't want to create things that were forced to go like high and fast. I wanted to be able to create things that had a kind of slow build and longevity. And I think this is partly because of the experiences I'd had, but also because I was working at the Center for Social Innovation in New York. I was actually there disruptor in residence for 6 months.
Great title.
Yeah, it was great. And I could see a lot of the amazing startups who had social motivators get investment, and that slowly start to erode. And that really worried me that, you know, it wasn't about like building the biggest, strongest, fastest, dominating thing. It was about disrupting the mainstream. So in the education startup, it was really about challenging the dominant idea of how we educate and also what we choose to educate. So teaching systems thinking, teaching sustainability, teaching design and creativity as tools for transformation. And so now, like the Unschool, which, you know, we used to run in-person experiences until COVID, and now we have a lot of extensive stuff online. It's 8 years old, and, you know, I know that my content from that is being used at universities all over the world, high schools all over the world. So, like, I just got some screen caps from Cambridge University that are using my stuff, and I'm always like, hilarious, because my goal was to get this content taught into my whole philosophy was that standard education system does not teach creativity or systems or dynamics or complexity. It teaches reductive, linear, and the reason we have a linear economy, extractive and exploitative, is because we all learn how to mimic that economy. So the Unschool was about undoing the damage of the mainstream education system and creating these different divergent ways of thinking and different skills and tools. So the fact that that's happening now is very rewarding, because the goal was to demonstrate. And if I had tried to do that from within a university, I do not think I would have had the effect that we've had today. So,
so maybe just going back to your timeline then. So
nothing's linear, man.
Nothing's linear, I know. And maybe it's my schooling. I keep coming back to linear anyway. So with eco-innovators, then I think, because also looking at your timeline, like all of this stuff then happens. You had like an amazing run in the last 7-8 years, you know, just with, how did you end up going to New York, for example, and starting? Well,
so I had Eco Innovators, and some hilarious things that happened, like I'd been invited as a judge on the TV show The New Inventors. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
That actually got canned not long after I became a judge. So you guys can figure out what that means. And I had this Melbourne Now, and I was doing my PhD, and it was coming towards the end. And I had been running Eco Innovators for like 5 or 6 years. And I had some clients and I was doing some stuff, but I wasn't getting like, I didn't feel like I was being challenged. And also Australia is a very small marketplace, right? There's 25 million people here. And so I really had this drive to like make something big and meaty and risky, but I didn't feel that I was able to do that here, or at least I felt like I wanted to be in a place where there was more people and more access and more, So it wasn't New York specifically. I actually just told everybody I was leaving and just like booked a one-way ticket I actually booked a ticket that went like LA, New York, Berlin. And I was like, one of those places will probably work. And I had no right to live in the US at all. And I got to LA and I started meeting with people I knew about making films and around sustainability. Like I was like, I need a new medium. Like I need a new, bigger way. And so, and then I got to New York and it was hilarious. Like as soon as I got there, like I said, everybody was moving faster than me. And I was like, this is the energy I need to do whatever I'm going to do. So I kind of set up shop there, meaning I just moved there. And I actually I met Natalie Jeremijenko, who I'm a really big fan of, who's a quite amazing artist and designer at NYU who has done some incredible projects. And if you don't know who she is, I highly recommend looking up her TEDx talk. She's quite an amazing woman. And she, invited me to be a visiting scholar at NYU with her, and whatever, I kind of hung out with her doing her crazy interventions. And I don't know what happened. One day I just woke up. So it's just kind of hanging, right? And I just woke up one day and I was like, I just scribbled on a piece of paper, the Unschool of Disruptive Design, and that was it. And then I just built it.
Wow.
It was really bizarre.
So it came to you in a dream.
God knows. And then I just built decks, and then I started pitching to I'd worked with Autodesk and Dassault and all these big companies. I was like, give me money to build a school for designers that teaches them how to make change. And they were all like, what a sweet idea. No, we're not going to give you money. And I'm like, I made this really sexy deck. Doesn't that deserve some money? And then of course that it was completely out of the mainstream system. It was absolutely, and at the beginning it had all these, it was like a co-working / co-living. It was all of the things. So it was a bit too much, I think, at the beginning. But I had this vision of bringing creatives together, like myself. I was like, well, if I have these challenges and I've had to overcome them through a lot of hard work, surely there's a bunch of other people out there who feel the same way. So what if I take what I've learned and make a really amazing experience and connect people and da-da-da. So then, I just kind of started building it and did it anyway. But I have a really funny story, actually. So it's the Unschool, so UN-School of Disruptive Design. That was the original name. And so when I went to register it with as a business in New York, the department of whatever comes back and says, you can't register it as the Unschool because it sounds too much like the UN. So you have to get some approval from the UN to use UN-schools. So I was like, that's not going to happen. I have no contacts to the UN. So I was like, okay, well, let's just register the Disrupt Design as the name. And so I accidentally created a design agency and a school at the same time. That's how it happened.
Because I was wondering.
Yeah, it was just a kind of accidental thing. Yeah. And then it was cool because I had keynoted the AIGA conference, which is the American Graphic Designers Association. And they had this beautiful office on 23rd Street. And so I just kind of went there one day and I was like, hi, I have this crazy idea. Nobody's giving me any money and I don't really have any money, but would you let me use your beautiful gallery space to do a launch party in a couple of months? And they were like, sure. And then it was hilarious because I also knew nobody in New York when I showed up. I knew one person. And we ran this on the 5th of September 2014. We had a launch party with 145 designers from New York show up. And we made this whole interactive experience, which was when you showed up, you got a little bit of a word that was zigzag cut and you had to find the other person to match it. And then there was a massive find a word on the wall. So then once you found your person, you then had to find it. I know, I'm really into experiences. And it was super fun. Yeah. And I just basically was like, I've launched these two things now. They're going to be great. And we're going to do stuff education and experience. So talk to me, let's see. And then I just started doing so much stuff. I was able to collaborate with all of these different organizations, and I was running these design, drink and design nights, which were challenges, and I was running these secret dinner parties, and I ran a park demolition tea party because they were demolishing a park in Brooklyn. It's anyone who would collaborate on something experiential about design and sustainability, I was like, let's do it. And then it just kind of evolved into designing a bigger experience and bringing people together. And so that's when I ran the first fellowship, which happened in New York in 2014. How did I do that in the same year? Maybe it was 2015. Oh, I'm not good with numbers, as we already discussed. So anyway, and I remember just putting like this call out to the internet, right? Of like, are there courageous people who will pay $2,500 to come for a 7-day experience that it's all secret? You just have to come and be willing.
I won't kidnap you.
Exactly. And it was amazing. Like it was amazing. And we got so many applicants, and I think I wanted to have 10 in the beginning. I think we ended up with 16 or 18 people from all over the world. And even Columbia University heard about it, and they sent a film crew to follow us for the whole week, which is on the internet somewhere.
Yeah.
I lost my voice. It was absolute magic, right? Like, so I designed like a menu of experiences that played out like that you didn't get to know what was happening, which is very hard for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But it gave me a lot of flexibility to adapt to the group. And of course, like I had a small team and we had all these different mentors that came in, like Natalie and all these other fascinating people, like the guy who started Etsy.org, just come in and like share their knowledge. And then we would have like experiential and then food and then like like highline, interactive, like everything. It was just like cognitive, experiential, like explosion. It was amazing. It really was amazing. And that was it. So then I did 10 of those in 10 different countries. And the way I did it was, and the way we did it was that an alumni who'd come to a program invited us to their country and they became the producer. And then we would do all the admin and bring it, and then they would invite us, and then we would bring a small team, and they'd get a team, and we'd fund them, and then they would host the whole experience. So
I saw you did one in Mumbai, which is my hometown.
So we did New York, then we went to Mexico City, and then we went to Sao Paulo, and then we went to where did we go after Sao Paulo? Then we went to San Francisco, Melbourne. We did it here. We did one in Christchurch. We did one in Mumbai, Cape Town. And we just did one in Kuching before COVID.
Damn.
It was amazing, yeah. And so then I bought a farm to run programs on because I wanted to, that whole designing the experience and being able to maximize it and everything. But the traveling to all these different destinations was a little exhausting. And also like, I mean, you can't do the same thing forever. Like that's always been my philosophy. And I like round numbers and whole things. So it's like 10 seems like a good number to, we were going to run an 11th, but then COVID happened. And that was because one of our alumni invited us to Cochabamba in Peru. And we were very desperate to go to like some of these economies that are not really exposed. And so that was going to be where we went next. But unfortunately, we weren't able to do that. So,
wow. And how did... Because I know, like, you've done a TED main stage talk, and that's got more than, I think, 2 million views or something.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It's like almost 10 years old now.
Yeah, wow. How did TED hear of you?
Yeah. So that year, which was 2013, TED ran a global talent search. They'd never done it before. And it was called The Young, the Wise, and the Undiscovered. And they asked existing TED speakers to, like, reach out to their networks and kind of tap people and say like, hey, you should apply. And that happened to me through a colleague that I knew. And you had to make a 60-second video of like your idea and then submit it. And then the curator of TED, Chris Anderson, and Kelly Sochel, who was second in charge, and a team traveled to 14 countries, I think. And they had like a selection of people that they watched. So like from thousands, they got hundreds, and then they picked 30 people. And I was selected and went to Sydney during the TEDx event and did it then. And it was pretty nerve-wracking because you basically had to do a practice run in front of Chris Anderson, which is pretty intimidating. And then get on the stage and like do your actual, you were only allowed 6 minutes, I think. And then they, you waited like 4 or 5 months to know if you had been selected. And I was selected, one of 30 people from around the world. And they gave me 18 minutes, which in TED world is like a pretty big accomplishment because it's the maximum number of minutes you can get, but also pretty horrifying because...
You got 18 minutes.
Yes.
On the red dot.
Yes. Yeah. In front of like all of these very, very wealthy and famous Americans. Yeah. And not many Australians had done main stage TED Talks at that stage.
Main stage TED Talks, like the people there pay like $10,000-$20,000 to be there. So
and they're like Bill Gates and famous people. Yeah, just wandering around.
Wow.
Yeah.
And do you think then that set you up for?
I think that TED gave me great exposure as they capitalize off that. You know, they don't pay their speakers, and that's kind of part of their whole thing because they are such a big platform and a community. And of course, like, you definitely, people have respect for your ideas if you are selected to do a TED Talk, and that's one of the other really good things about it is their curation is incredible. Like, they do such a good job of curating different ideas and opinions and controversial, but also they really help the speakers make quite an amazing talk. So that is unto itself a kind of like validation. So for sure, that helped me get exposure to a wider, broader community and audience. But like, my TED Talk has not been watched that many times. Like, if I was talking about a social issue or relationships or any of the things that we all just can't help but, you know, watch, then it would be like 20 million views. I'm talking about refrigerators and kettles being badly designed, right?
And plastic and paper bags.
Yeah, exactly. So it's definitely obscure in that sense, right? And I've done a couple TEDx's since then, which have been really fun to like challenge myself to find, you know, one of my favorites is the How Do You Value Invisible Things, which is much more about economics.
Pineapples and diamonds.
Yeah, exactly. But it's kind of my thing to find everyday objects and embed narratives in them or counterintuitive narratives. That's like what my like magic sauce is.
Yep.
And I love it because I can't help but question things around me. Like, it's kind of what has happened my whole life. But yeah, I think it's definitely been a great elevator, but of my ideas and, you know, my capacity. But I don't think it's the driving thing that's made me successful. I definitely think that a lot of the projects I've done, like, I've built a lot of different projects, right? So they have like these weird lives of their own, and it's really bizarre how then people become quite like I have a lot of people who are really into my educational tools, right? Like the circular classroom, or we collaborated with the UN on the anatomy of action. So yeah, and I mean, for me, it's like any way that I can help other people make change. So the TED Talk was definitely a way of challenging people to think differently about the problems that we face and how we solve them. And like, now I get to work with like refrigerator companies and help them, challenge them to design refrigerators differently, you know? It's like, so yeah.
So just to, I suppose, you know, this is my, again, my linear thinking, but with the disruptive design thing and the Unschool.
Oh yeah, back in New York,
Yeah, if you could, I suppose, maybe box them up and tie a nice little neat bow on them, just in terms of
what they do now. Well, when I started, I didn't really know, as I think we've now discovered is my general way of doing things. Like, I bought a farm and didn't know what I was going to do with that either.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the Disrupt, we take commissions to design interventions, you know, so sometimes we're running education experiences with engineering teams for some of the world's biggest companies. Other times we're collaborating with Oxfam to design, you know, workshops to help elevate people in emerging economies, or we've designed a toolkit with them. We did a report called The Decade of Disruption, which you would love, which is all about looking at the mega trends of this decade for an interesting company in the UK. So we're basically quite selective. We take projects. We designed an entire learning system for Thailand for an education system. So it's called the Changemaker Lab. And we went out and like created a really culturally appropriate tool that would help young people think differently about themselves and the world around them and make change, et cetera, et cetera. So we do these kind of fun, meaty projects that like are going to have an impact and effect. And actually Disrupt has a kind of rule that any client we sign up, they have to commit to giving away 20% of the content we create to them for free, for them for free. So even if it's a commercial product or something, we have to make sure that we take a chunk of it and then make something that then can be distributed to help like give back to the community in some way. And so that's been a really interesting thing that we always negotiate, and I think it has quite an interesting effect because these companies are like, oh yeah, why don't we do that? Like, you know. So yeah, that's Disrupt. And Disrupt runs the Unschool, which is an experimental knowledge lab for adults. And it's still experimental, even though it's been going for 8 years. And as I explained, you know, we ran in-person programs, but now we predominantly have an online learning system with over 100 courses, classes, handbooks, toolkits, a bunch of free stuff, a bunch of paid stuff. You can take the entire disruptive design methodology, which is 12 units that I explain things like gamification and game theory, or language and influence, or systems thinking, systems intervention, sustainability sciences, cognitive biases, or you can take a learning track and get certified as a practitioner, an unmasters, or an educator, or you can just take a class in like what is life cycle thinking. And yeah, we've written a bunch of handbooks that are available there on like the disruptive design method, or I just recently wrote a new one. I even wrote a cookbook on how to love vegetables.
Oh, wow.
That was a COVID therapy project. That's what we'll call it.
Yeah.
Lockdown therapy project. But yeah, so the Unschool is really a community as well. We have an app where people who are tracking or, really deeply into becoming, disruptive designers or creative people, you don't have to be a designer, right? Like, so yeah, a lot of people, community development and so forth. And then I actually have a new project.
Cool.
Which is taking me a lot longer. Every time I do a new project, I'm like, this will be like 6 months. 18 months later, you're like, okay, I think I still have another 6 months. Called Swivel Skills. So it's a new project for Disrupt Design. And it is basically an e-learning platform to help major companies and SMEs level up the skill set across their entire workforce to address the sustainability, climate literacy, and circular economy challenges. So it's basically an synchronous learning platform that really chunkifies the key pieces of information so that people will have a core language. They understand what like net zero means. They understand what product stewardship is, as well as why and how to apply it in a business context. Because there is absolutely no content that applies to businesses transforming to sustainability that understands the business case and needs. So my hypothesis is that other times that we've had big transformation in society, in business, has been the OH&S movement, occupational health and safety, and then the shift to digital. So both times, every company had to figure out how to train all their staff to be able to have the skills to either not kill themselves or their colleagues, or to figure out how to use the internet. Right? And both times, they essentially lent on service providers to create easy to understand learning systems that could be done as onboarding or PD within a company. And that's basically what Swivel Skills is.
Some hilarious videos to go along with it.
Yeah, so this is actually really fun. It's I now that since that first one, I just do all the voiceovers. But yeah, this is really fun because so it's like very chunkified, but also there's all these like little drag and drop interactive learning quizzes and stuff. Like I love making things sexy and fun, and it's definitely that, right? It's beautifully designed. And so we're launching the foundation program, which is basically sustainability, climate literacy, and the circular economy. And then we have all these additional modules. So depending on what industry you're in, if you're in finance, you need to know about ESG. If you're in the building sector, you need to know about the building council regulations. And then also the changing regulatory landscape is happening so quickly right now. Like the European Union just brought on like 7 new legislative frameworks that will go into effect in 2024 about substantiating green claims, so how to not do greenwashing, mandatory reporting on sustainability. So like that's going to affect 50,000 companies in the next year, and there's nowhere for these people to learn how to do these things. So that's like my next massive project, and we've been working on that now, and hopefully 2023 will be live and helping companies level up their workforce.
Amazing. And we link to all of this in the show notes. But just to wrap this up, but thank you so much firstly for doing this and coming down to my
Cellar.
padded cell between me and the phone, which is not even a phone.
No, it's not. It needs a dust as well.
And it's kind of amazing how your story has come full circle, I think, from the 5-year-old who's worried about the ozone layer to then chairing at the UN, a panel of various environment ministers from around the world. That's not full circle, I don't know.
Yeah, and also actually, you know how I said when I founded the US company, I had to have this UN. Well, so then when I got named Champion of the Earth, I started working with the UN a lot more. And so many people would say, oh my God, I love the UN school. These are people who work for the UN. And I'd be like, okay, we have to really change the branding. And it's so funny though, that also came full circle as well, right?
Yeah, wow. So the UN School of Disruptive, no.
Yeah, but it's funny. Yeah, it's hilarious. And I would tell them the story about how I couldn't make it like the official name. So,
Cool. So just to finish up, this is usually the last question. So this is the On Meaningful Work podcast. And So what does the term on meaningful work mean to you?
Is there off meaningful work as well?
Could be, yeah. That's another podcast.
Well, if there's an on or off. Well, I mean, meaningful, I guess, for me really is about what matters. I've actually always thought about words like matter, which can define physical things or non-physical things that are of importance or have weight or that exist, because we talk about matter. There's matter in the universe and what matters or doesn't matter. And I think so for me, like, I personally desperately want the things that I do in the world to matter, either to me or to other people. And that's not to say like that when I say desperately, I mean it's because I want, if you're going to invest energy and resources in things, you would hope that they would have meaning embedded in them, or that they have the opportunity to have meaning ascribed to them over time. I feel very fortunate that I had that experience in design school, and that I didn't go on to be, you know, a designer who created crap to sell to idiots, and then had a revelation when I was 30. You know, I was very fortunate that at a young age I had this like deep, profound, like passion be ignited, and it helped steer the direction of my career, and continues to, in a way that is very meaningful for me, exhausting at times, you know, but also that is extremely rewarding, because I get to engage with so many people and learn so many things from all these people that I engage with, and to see that change happen from like these small creative ideas that then have these sometimes big impacts and sometimes just beautiful little transference. So for me, meaningful work is really about applying your creative kind of essence to the things that you are frustrated by.
That's brilliant. That's brilliantly put. Yeah.
Yeah, and then hopefully having a transformative experience for yourself and the people around you, or the people who get to engage with it. Yeah.
I think that's a beautiful place to end, Leyla. So again, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for the fascinating conversation.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you're enjoying and are learning from this podcast, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple, and Spotify. A great zero-cost way to support us is to leave a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you are feeling extra generous, it would be great if you could leave a comment or feedback on our Apple Podcast or YouTube pages. Or you could email your comments and feedback to me directly at rahul@disruptivebusinessnetwork.com. That's RAHUL at disruptivebusinessnetwork, all one word, .com. Finally, a big shout out to our producer Dan Scahill for his work on the keys, and to Vashti Civil for writing the original music for our theme. Until next time, this is your host, Rahul Sohns, signing off. Bye.